is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
7 years ago, member states of the African Union gathered here in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the organization's founding. It is also at that gathering in 2013 that representatives from across the continent singled out armed conflict as the biggest barrier to development on the continent. The African Union then vowed to silence the guns of armed conflict by the year 2020. Well, it is now 2020, but the guns have not yet fully fallen silent, and the African Union is now taking stock. Leaders from across the continent have once again assembled here in Ethiopia this week to review the journey that started 7 years ago. So, since 2013, have gains been made in Africa's call to end violent conflict? And what new moves will the African Union need to make for a conflict-free continent beyond 2020? I'm Beatrice Marshall from the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa. Welcome to this special edition of Talk Africa. Now, as at 2013, it is estimated that armed conflict cost Africa $18 billion each year and shrunk affected economies by at least 15%, triggering a negative domino effect on human lives and the larger economy. So, have these figures changed? And what is the picture of conflict in Africa today? Well, I sat down with a panel of experts to look at this issue and more. Dr. Solomon Derso is the African Union Commissioner for Human Rights, and Lizel Vodran is a senior analyst with the Institute for Security Studies. Let's listen in on how that conversation went. Commissioner Derso, Lizel, thank you very much both for joining us on Talk Africa. Commissioner, let me start off with you because silencing the guns, creating a conducive condition for Africa's development, that is the theme for the AU Summit 2020. As a flagship project of Agenda 2063, silencing the guns by 2020 was first mooted in 2013. First of all, tell us, what is the significance of that theme today?
This theme is significant because it is one of, if not the primary factors that led to the transformation of the Organization of African Unity to the African Union. In establishing the African Union, states parties to the act establishing the African Union, the Constitutive Act, clearly indicated that the scourge of violence is a major threat for the development, for freedom and dignity on the African continent, that they need to put in place a mechanism for dealing with that scourge of conflict. So it is indeed a major issue that is wired, in the identity of the African Union. And part of the pledge, for example, that states, member states of the African Union made when they celebrated the 50 years anniversary of the Organization of African Unity, the African Union, was not to pass to the next generation an Africa that is not at peace with itself. So the theme of the year, for all these historical reasons, but importantly on account of the fact that we do have today more conflicts. We do have today incidents of violence and conflict increasing at an alarming scale, and they are spreading in terms of geographic scope, and they are causing a great deal of havoc in parts of the continent. So it is becoming a threat that is going to sabotage whatever gains that have been made in terms of the socioeconomic engagements of member states.
Let's go through that scourge of violence, because the idea in 2033 was to end all conflict and violent conflict on the continent. And as the Commissioner has said, the scale of violence is getting more. as we go by. Assess for us this, though, over the last 7 years. Is it getting more? Is it getting less? What impact has that theme had since 2013?
Yes, I mean, we can debate saying that, for example, in the 1990s, we saw many more coups d'etats, for example. That is one of the areas where the African Union has been successful in really stamping out on military regimes on the continent, right? So we have progress when it comes to elections, democracy, but the actual violent threat, I agree, has increased. If we look, for example, in the Sahel region, the number of attacks in Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger doubled between 2018 and 2019. There are now something like 600,000 refugees in Burkina Faso from that violence, and we, at the Institute for Security Studies have looked at the spread of it to coastal states. We've seen some incidents in places on the West African coast as well. It's extremely concerning, and it is spreading, as the Commissioner said. We have in Southern Africa really a very stable region that haven't had any open conflicts for decades. Now in northern Mozambique there is a major security threat, an insurgency linked to the Islamic State is claiming some of the responsibilities of those attacks. I can't even name all of them. We have Somalia, of course, Libya, South Sudan, the Central African Republic, where protracted conflicts have been going on for many years, and what President Cyril Ramaphosa and taking over as chair of the African Union has said is that it's possible for the African Union and for the continent to look at new ways of solving these conflicts. It's not easy because in many instances you are also dealing with global interests, military presence of many international actors. So Africa is not alone in, can't deal with this alone because of the presence of so many interests. Even, as I say, Mozambique, which is really on South Africa's doorstep, there's a Russian military presence, there's, many economic interests from around the world in that area. So if you look at the continent today, there might be more elections, fewer coups d'etats, fewer country-to-country interstate conflicts, but intrastate rebellions, jihadism, and then countries that are really almost failed states, like falling apart, like Libya and
the nature of the conflict, Commissioner, seems to have changed, though, and as Lizzle says, the actual violence has increased. What is causing the increase?
So there are a number of factors, of course, as far as why this is happening. Part of it has to do with some of it is structural. We have to make a distinction between the structural causes of these situations and the drivers of violence. I think on the driver side, obviously, I think there are a number of factors. One of them has to do with the illicit flow of arms. It is the fact that arms have become easily accessible, flowing all the way from Libya across the Sahel, and the proliferation of, importantly, jihadist groups, armed militants. That is what is making difficult. And of course, I think it's the response sometimes also tends to be highly militaristic. And when you try to deal with those situations with principally militaristic or security-heavy responses, then it can go only some distance in addressing the situation.
So we're going to look at that in a minute, but I do want to get your thoughts, Lizzle, on this, because it looks like the nature of the conflict and the nature of what we are dealing with today is quite different from the conflicts we were dealing with in the 70s, in the 60s, and in the 80s Africa. Do you think the AU has the capability to silence the guns then, as we talk about the new evolution? Do you think the AU has the capacity to silence the guns by the period we are talking about?
It is extremely difficult because there are new threats emerging. And we are not even, we don't even know how in the next 10, 20 years with new technology and with, social media that is being used to undermine sometimes democracies. Also it's a positive force for some, but the emerging threats on the continent leading up to 2063, I think we are not even clear to measure. But it is the core business of the African Union, almost, if I can put it that way, that can say we are sending troops, peacekeepers to the Central African Republic or to Somalia, or, that this has been, I would say, one of the core issues that the African Union has dealt with. And I think we are very easy sometimes to judge maybe the lack of progress, and the African Union also can't be better than its member states, if we see the challenges that we have. But since the early 2000s, the first African Union mission into Burundi, actually established a measure of peace in that country. There have been successes dating back to, let's say, the last 2 decades. We can go, maybe later on we can go into the details of who in the AU is responsible for what, but very generally I think there have been successes, but it's not an easy task.
So let's get those specific successes that the AU has had in terms of silencing the guns over the last 7 years that we've been talking about silencing the guns. Where have those guns exactly been silenced, and what kind of capacity does the AU have to ensure that the silencing the guns by 2063 or by 2030 or by 2020 actually becomes a reality?
So, there are a number of places, of course, that you can cite for the interventions of the African Union having made change. You may recall, for example, in the early 2000, or perhaps even until 2010, 2011, Somalia has been completely written off as a lost case, as a case that has no hope. That was how Somalia has been perceived. And it was the deployment of African Union mission to Somalia. With a great deal of sacrifice, I think I would like to emphasize this point. We don't have the exact figures of the casualties of African troops who laid down their lives for bringing about that critical change that has given hope for Somalis, that have given hope for all of us about Somalia. So, that is a major achievement for the African Union, having established its peace and security architecture only in the year 2000, all right? And when it established its security architecture in the year 2000, it was confronted with 2 things. One is it has to kind of go and be a firefighter, because it has to respond to the fires that have already broken. At the same time, it has to build its capacity by putting in place those institutions that are required for effective response.
But yet Libya, South Sudan and CAR and DRC are still in turmoil.
That is very true, all right? It's extremely important to understand the mechanism and techniques. Now, that is why we are saying, okay, at the moment, for example, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, of which I'm, the chairperson, we issued a statement just a couple of days ago expressing grave alarm about the spread and spike of violence on the continent. The reason for that is basically it is resulting in an increase, a very alarming increase in fatalities, particularly civilians being victimized. It is leading to huge numbers of displacement of civilians, mostly women, not only getting displaced, but also becoming targets of sexual violence, abductions, killings happening, extrajudicial killings happening. This is of serious concern for us as the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And it is on that account that we are saying, look, the African Union at the time of its establishment, the dominant feature of conflict was one that shows that there are rebel groups that have political agenda, which may lead to, the deployment by the African Union or regional economic communities of a peacemaking process, all right? So that there is a political agenda that can be negotiated between the parties, and then you can have a power-sharing government, you can have a new constitution, and so on and so forth. Let's not forget, for example, what the African Union did also to Kenya, for example, in bringing the parties, and then the parties ultimately having a peace deal, which led to the adoption of the 2010 constitution. Now, the nature of conflict has completely changed. I think it's important to understand that. More and more, the kinds of conflict that we are seeing, extremely localized, being carried out by actors that do not have, I think it's difficult to say, a political agenda, so to speak. These are basically mostly driven by what you may consider to be either jihadist or what you may consider to be criminal objectives, okay? And if you want to deploy those mechanisms that were meant to be applied for purpose of, mediating a civil war, they wouldn't be able to deal with that.
We'll take a short break now, but we'll continue with our conversation on the African Union theme of silencing the guns in a moment. Don't go away.
Life moves pretty fast. Ideas move at the speed of sound. Technology moves at the speed of light. If you don't filter out the noise, you might miss the details. We pay attention to the details because they matter, showing you a different perspective. See the difference.
All right, Liz, I want to get your thoughts here because the Commissioner has brought in a few interesting points. What are your thoughts on foreign interference or foreign intervention in African situations or challenges, particularly on the background of that mantra of African solutions to African problems?
Yes, I mean, we have to admit that in many cases African countries have invited in foreign military powers. I mean, that has been the case in Mali since 2013. The French presence, I mean, France has about 5,000 troops of Operation Barkhane now based in Chad, focusing on the jihadist threat. As I said, President Nyusi in Mozambique invited Russian military assistance in Mozambique. We have, across the continent actually, it's intertwined with also arms sales. I mean, we shouldn't neglect the actual commercial aspect of all of these, and foreign military powers wanting their presence there. I think, of course, African solutions to African problems, that was a slogan that emerged because there was this feeling that when it comes to financing of African-led peacekeeping operations and, in all aspects, I think it started maybe with the DRC, that sentiment that, well, it's just the United Nations that is all over the continent sending peacekeeping troops. So the feeling was African-led peacekeeping operations supported financially by the international community, and we're still fighting about that. And we're hoping that in this year, 2020, South Africa is still a non-permanent member of the African Union, the United Nations Security Council, chairing the AU, that debate about financing of AU peacekeeping operations will, we'll get somewhere with that. African countries are contributing to the AU Peace Fund quite considerably, which is new in the last year or so. So the African solutions, as I say, I think some progress has been made, but we must also remember that the African Union can come with norm setting. It has its convening powers, it's got its structures like the Peace and Security Council, it's got its African Peace and Security Architecture. But if individual member states are inviting foreign presence on the continent, then it's tricky for the African Union to then untangle that foreign military presence, which is growing in some parts of the continent.
Your thoughts, Commissioner, against the background of what has happened to Libya and against the background of what we are seeing in Eastern DRC with the longest serving UN peacekeeping force?
So, in the context of Libya, the lesson is basically this one. I think it's extremely important that the intervention, if it is on the basis of, for example, let's say Article 4H of the Constitutive Act, which authorizes intervention for purpose of securing, civilians from genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, then the purpose should just be that. Don't bring in and confuse that purpose for geostrategic purposes and for settling scores. If you do that, then you end up doing what you did in Libya. What happened in Libya is so tragic that basically in the end it defeated a very important purpose, that was securing Libyans from violence. It actually put Libyans in unprecedented violent situation. So the lesson is basically, it's important that whatever intervention that happens, it happens on the basis of rules and by respecting those rules. I think that's extremely important. Finally, and most importantly, it has to be on the basis of consensus between not only the country, the affected country, not only by the United Nations, but also with the regional countries, who in the end would bear direct consequences of the fallout of that situation. And that's exactly what happened. Why we have Sahel today has direct relations and links with what happened in Libya, with what continues to happen in Libya. There is a fire in Libya, and what many countries are doing is basically adding fuel to the fire, bringing in weapons and throwing weapons into the hands of this faction or that faction. That is how we have reached this point. And the fire is actually expanding. I think that's extremely important. And in terms of the DRC, the lesson from the DRC is, I think national leadership is extremely important, wherever it may be. So the national authority, the national leadership, particularly on the part of national political actors, is extremely important. But even that one wouldn't be enough unless and otherwise you have empowered citizens who have a belief in the possibility of those in authority delivering on their mandate.
So I want to get a final comment from both of you. And Lizel, let me start off with you, because this is now the decade of silencing the guns, and this is a slogan and a project that will continue until 2063. Realistically though, looking at the evolving nature of the challenges that you've talked about, no longer the challenges of the 70s, now new challenges in this decade, when do you think, or how do you see Africa silencing the guns, and when do you think that time frame will be?
Yes, that's I wouldn't like to set new deadlines, because that was probably the problem in 2013, to say this will happen in 2020. And then, as we have been discussing about the emerging threats, I think for now is to look at, is the AU fit for purpose? And I think it is getting there. You need innovation, younger people, effective institutions to be able to respond to a very shifting landscape, as we've been discussing, and also to improve the capacity of the institutions to actually intervene. I mean, it's very difficult to say, well, if we hadn't sent a mediator to Madagascar, the country would have imploded in 2018 because there was a political strife, But the AU did, and there was a solution. So it's very, very difficult to prove things that didn't happen. So within that context, I think going forward, looking at, and I mean that the Commissioner and others are busy doing, is looking at the institutions and to make them more effective, and to be ahead of the curve when it comes to emerging threats. The problem that we set the African Union is an intergovernmental organization of sovereign states. When it comes to early warning, which is what you had just raised, that is the fundamental tricky thing. The Peace and Security Council, the African peer review mechanism, we can all sit here and say there is an emerging threat. We can see it's happening. There's climate change, there's this and this and this factors. But then to tell a foreign state, yes, but there's a problem in your country, you have to solve it before it becomes, it escalates. That is the big question. And I mean, that is where the African Union's hands are a little bit tied, you know. Because to deal with a threat, there has to be an acknowledgement, but we often only acknowledge it when the fire is already, you know, sky high, unfortunately.
Is there a practical time frame, and what are the practical measures that the African Union would want to put in place to ensure that that becomes a reality?
I think one of the most important things that needs to happen is basically the situation is such that it doesn't allow us to continue in the business as usual fashion. What it means is basically that we have to up our engagement higher, and we have also to assume greater responsibility, particularly member states of the African Union institutions, and it's extremely important that for all of this, leadership becomes so critical and so key. With leadership that actually acknowledges and recognizes that there is a problem, and with leadership that is able to look for and mobilize concerted effort from the institutions and from member states is one that can be able to deliver. That's why, for example, you know, the leadership of the African Union Assembly becomes important as well. That's why it's also important the leadership of the African Union Commission itself becomes extremely important. These are the kinds of things that we need to see happening. But importantly, as far as conflicts are concerned, it is important, you know, yes, the security actors, okay, those people with weapons, we need to deal with them without a doubt, okay? They become our target. But, okay, even for dealing with them, you can't do that if you don't have your citizens, if you don't have your people with you. You need to have and to bring people to the center of the search for solution. What that requires you to do is basically what are the needs of people. People in this time and age may not actually expect a handout by government. What they need is basically for government to do the minimum things it's supposed to do, for example, in terms of creating the conditions that make it possible for an ordinary person to pursue the goals of getting, you know, what needs for purpose of living a dignified life. That is extremely important. And for that, of course, you need to have good governance. You need to have human rights, human and people's rights respected. You need to have strong institutions. These are the prerequisite for achieving stability, peace, and at the end of the day, all of this for dignity of African people.
All right, Commissioner Derso and Lizel Lowe, to you both, a very interesting discussion. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
And that's all we have time for this week on Talk Africa. A very big thank you to our guests for their insights. Do follow this conversation on a conflict-free Africa on our social media handles. And join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall from Addis Ababa, it's goodbye.